Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
Last week, after a heated debate, the Senedd voted to approve the recommendations of the report of the Special Purpose Committee on Senedd Reform. But what exactly are those recommendations, and will all of them actually happen? Joining me to discuss this is Jess Blair, Director of the Electoral Reform Society Cymru. Hi, Jess.
Hello, Matt. How are you?
Very well, thank you very much for coming on. Before we start, congratulations. As those who eagerly watch all Welsh Government press releases will know, you've just been appointed to the expert panel of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. Congratulations, Jess.
Thank you so much. I think it's the first time expert's ever been anywhere near my name. But I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting process and really looking forward to working on it.
Great. Well, let's talk about the report then. Would you be able to outline some of the recommendations of the report and tell us a little bit about how we've got here?
Oh, where to start? It's been a long journey, hasn't it? Yeah, so the Special Purpose Committee on Senedd Reform, not to be confused with any of the previous committees on Senedd Reform, has recommended an increase in the size of the Senedd to 96 members. They will be elected by a closed list proportional system using the Hont method, which is as sexy as it sounds, and there will be integrated gender quotas. There's also going to be a new way that elections are working in Wales in terms of boundaries. So we're looking at moving to 16 constituencies with 6 members in each. I think that's a very quick overview, but I'm sure we'll get into the detail.
Let's take each aspect of that in turn. I think the arguments about whether the Senedd needed more members or not has been done to death. We won't need to do that. But the fact that 96 members was arrived at, do you think that's the right number? Some would say that an increase of sort of 10 to 15 would have been understandable, but an increase of this amount is only justified if there was something significant being devolved to the Senedd. What's your view on that?
Well, I think my view on it is if you're going to do this, let's do it properly and let's do it once. Ultimately, we've been calling for the Senedd to be increased in size since it was the National Assembly. I think the first report that came out recommending an increase was the Ritchie Commission back in 2004. So this has been something that is a long time coming. And I think 96 is right, and it is in line with other institutions. If you look at parliaments and kind of legislatures across Europe, across the world even, this is about right. It is in line, if slightly small, but I think we should welcome the fact it's moved to 96. That's an appropriate size. You know, when you consider Northern Ireland has 90 MLAs, the Scottish Parliament has 129 MSPs. It is right that Wales now will have a parliament that has the capacity to scrutinise 17 billion pounds worth of government spending every year, that will scrutinise legislation that will change people's lives, hopefully. You know, if we're going to have a parliament, let's equip it properly and let's make it work effectively.
One of the criticisms of these proposals was the fact that the constituencies that have been proposed to be used, sort of the Senedd using Westminster proposed constituencies that may never actually be used, but obviously they are going to have an internal boundary review within the next Senedd term. Do you think this is the right system to use? Do you think that that's just some sort of weird foible of the whole negotiating process, or do you think there could have been a better way of drawing up these boundaries?
I think there's a little bit of kind of realpolitik with this committee report, because it does reflect a deal that was made between Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru as part of the cooperation agreement. And I think we've got to be realistic that I think it's fair to say that no parties internationally that have ever, sat in government will easily go to systems that they potentially might give up power on that basis of. So I think there's always got to be a little bit of recognition that this is a political deal, but it is one that I think in the round will further Wales and it will further our parliament. So I think ERS quite fairly has some criticism of the proportional list system that's been proposed, the closed list element of that, and the fact that it restricts choice for voters. And also we probably wouldn't have gone down this route on boundaries either, although we don't have a set view. I think there has been a lot of conversation about things like local authorities boundaries, and that's what the expert panel recommended, and I think with good reason. But 16 is quite close to the 17 that the expert panel actually proposed. I think the test is really going to be the 2026 elections, when we'll see how they work in practice. There was a lot of debate around this last week in the Senedd, and some people rightly pointed out that these 16 are actually at least based on constituencies that the Boundary Commission have actually looked into and have assessed along a kind of range of principles. So there is that argument for them. So a little bit of probably a mixed answer hedging my bets. It's not necessarily what I would have gone for, but I think the proof will be in the pudding, and hopefully the 2026 election we'll be able to see how they work. I am a little bit concerned with the fact that the boundary review is going to take place before that election, so we might not necessarily get to learn any lessons afterwards, but hopefully there will be an opportunity after that election to kind of correct anything, including around the electoral system, that we think might not actually suit the way that a Senedd election should work.
And there's lots of people very hopeful that the electoral system may change, but we'll get on to electoral systems now. So many different systems have been talked about in the long history of this process, sort of STV, Santlager. But why do you think that these particular suggestions were rejected?
It's a funny one, isn't it? So the single transferable vote is the system that we at ERS would always support. I think it's a really good system that would really work well with the Senedd elections. It's also been something that the expert panel and the previous Senedd committee on Senedd committee on Senedd reform. God, I get confused.
The Dawn Bowden one.
The other one, the Dawn Bowden committee. Yeah. They also echoed that recommendation. But I think it's been a real battle within the parties, to be honest with you, about what this system could actually be. And I kind of see it that within parties there's a spectrum, right? And you've got people advocating for loads of different systems, and they've got kind of reservations about others. So on one side you might get people proposing first past the post, which we know would never be part of this deal anyway, because the kind of basis of it was something that was at least as proportional as the current system. But there will have been people arguing within parties for that system. On the other side, you would have had people arguing for STV. I think what we've ended up with is a reflection of the way political parties work and the way political leadership works. And it's something that is in the middle. It moves to multi-member constituencies, it rejects first past the post, but it doesn't necessarily deliver choice for voters. So we've ended up with a little bit of a middleman in terms of an electoral system. I do think it lays the groundwork for potentially an improvement further down the line. You know, I don't want to have to revisit Senedd reform for a long time yet, but maybe we can learn from moving to multi-member systems that actually this is a good way to go, and maybe we can move from closed lists to flexible lists, and then maybe a bit more open. I'm still kind of optimistic that there is a lot of support for flexible lists within the Senedd, and that isn't STV, but that could deliver something better than the closed lists that have been proposed. Our main concerns with those closed lists are that they restrict voter choice. So when you get a ballot paper, you have no decision on who your actual elected representative is. You just have that party and their list that they have proposed. So I think that that really is the big challenge. It is a reflection of that realpolitik, like I said, but it's one that I think is sitting a little bit uncomfortably at the moment with a lot of politicians.
We'll definitely get into that in a moment. But I think you've very very expertly explained why we've ended up, the realpolitik of why we end up in this situation. But do you think that this is a good electoral system? And do you think that it is a more proportionate one than we currently have?
It's really hard to say whether something's going to be more proportional because we cannot model, because we've never used those boundaries that it's actually going to be used before. One of the things that affects how proportionate a voting system is going to be is the way that votes are allocated. And at present, the deal and the Senedd Special Purpose Committee are proposing the D'Hondt method. So we would kind of say that actually that is a method that might deliver better results for larger parties, and it might threaten the proportionality of closed lists. So I would hope that over the next year, as government lawyers are kind of drafting this, they are looking to ensure that this is a deal that gives us a more proportional system. I think at least as proportional is a baseline that politicians have been working with. We should always be kind of striving to do better. Right, we should always be striving to deliver people a better system, because that's what this is about. It's about people getting to the ballot box and actually having their vote reflected back at them and having elected representatives. You know, they've got 6 of them. Hopefully there's 1 or 2 of them that they could actually engage with and feel like actually reflect their views. So I think that is one element that really needs looking at potentially. But the proof's going to be in the pudding of how the election actually works. And there's always going to be things that we don't know until that actually happens.
Are there any other concerns you have about the system? I mean, one of the things that's been levelled at it is that it will provide too much power to the political parties over the voter. Do you think that's something that is accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is that most people aren't members of a political party, and a lot of what's going to be decided on election day at the ballot box is actually going to be a little bit of a foregone conclusion, because parties and party members will have had their say in how exactly those lists are going to be ordered. And that's really why we have many reservations about the closed list proportional system that's been proposed. I would take that, I think, with a little bit of a health warning, because we do actually, support multi-member constituencies. We support the fact that it's rejected first past the post. It's almost like it's just nearly there. It's just close but no cigar. So if you just move to a system where you have those list systems but voters have choice, you're suddenly in a much better arena. And I do think that that's where there's room for improvement, but also realistic room for improvement here. We're not asking for much more. We're asking for a bit of flexibility in flexible lists where voters can choose to vote for either a party as the party list has been chosen, or they can vote for an individual member. And that's something that we really hope politicians, take under advisement over the next year as lawyers start drafting this legislation.
I mean, one of the things that I read was that there was a rejection of STV because Welsh voters aren't used to that electoral system. But they are, of course, at a local government level, used to picking between candidates of different parties, of course, aren't they? So this does feel a little bit like Labour don't want to give people as much choice and the ability to differentiate between, maybe mix and match their candidates. They want to be able to make people vote Labour if they want a Labour representative. I can't get my words out today, but that's what I was trying to get the point across.
All of the words I use in politics are actually really hard. I can't say it before. Don't get me started on participative budgeting, because I have to say it really slowly. On STV, there is a lot of evidence from other nations that are really close to home that voters can use it really well and really expertly. It only took between the 2007 and 2011 local elections in Scotland for voters to start extending the number of choices they make when they're actually ranking voters. Voters adapted to STV really quickly, and when they moved from first past the post up in Scotland. So there's no reason why Welsh voters would be any different. There's also, I think, the prospect of local authorities moving to STV in the next 5 years. I think it is, it's never going to be that all 22 local authorities are actually going to do it, but we might see one or two leading the way in the next few years. And we might then have a case study of voters using STV really proficiently when there's actually a patchwork of electoral systems across Wales. So I do worry that particular reasoning in the report won't bear out as time goes on.
So this system, I think, I know we can't say for certain until we see how people vote, but it does feel very beneficial to the Labour Party. Why do you think Plaid Cymru were so in favour of this? Do you think it was just a trade-off for the numbers that they then eventually got?
The big selling point for Plaid Cymru around the closed list PR system has, the way that they've explained it anyway, been the ability to integrate gender quotas and use zipping. I think Plaid Cymru, if I'm being really honest, have been really concerned about, if you're going to use gender quotas, how do we make sure that they're effective? And I really feel that this compromise has been made a little bit easier for them because of this selling point around integrating gender quotas via zipping. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out as well. I'm sure we'll get on to the discussion around gender quotas, but I do think that that's the compromising element here for Plaid Cymru.
Let's deal with that now. So, like you raised, one of the things that the Welsh Conservatives raised in the Senedd and have done previously also is raise concerns about the fact that the Senedd may not have the power to introduce gender quotas, not having sufficient powers over gender equality. Do you think that is actually the case, and the Senedd may struggle to do this? I think it's very likely that these quotas, that aspect of the bill, may end up in court anyway. Do you think that this could theoretically see that two separate bills introduced, or some sort of workaround like that?
So at ERS, we worked with our friends at the Women's Equality Network Wales, I think back in January, February, and actually commissioned a lawyer with a lot of constitutional expertise who's worked on Supreme Court cases to give their legal advice on this. And we went into it like, we just want some legal advice. Like, where does where does Wales stand in terms of its powers to legislate on quotas? We didn't kind of precursor it saying we want to hear yes, we wanted to hear how does it actually work, and they came back saying it should be within competency. We can't really see any issues. It can quite easily tie into electoral systems, which are devolved on the basis of elections, and then if it doesn't, there are exceptions to reservations around the Equality Act. It is within the spirit of the Equality Act. So I think there is a really good case to be made that this is within competency. However, that isn't to say that a UK government might object to the fact that Wales is legislating around this and threaten or indeed take the Welsh Government to court or take this bill to the Supreme Court. So I think there's a lot of political discussions that need to take place to ensure that that doesn't happen. Just because it is within competency doesn't stop it necessarily getting held up in court. So I think there's conversations that need to be had between Welsh Government and the Secretary of State for Wales to really ensure that this does go through as planned. I really do believe that it is devolved and within competency. Why should the Senedd not be able to make legislation on their electoral arrangements? That is entirely devolved. So I think fun and games ahead, but I'm sure it'll win out in the day. I do have massive concerns about separating out the quotas element into a separate bill. I think that probably does undermine the competency case a little bit, but we'll defer to the experts in Welsh Government to see which is the best way to get this through.
The electoral system, I think, just for a second, one of the parties in Wales that is most in favour of Senedd reform historically has been the Liberal Democrats, but they are not in favour of these reforms. How do smaller parties like the Liberal Democrats and independents, how will they fare under this system? Is it? Do you think? Obviously, we can't tell for certain.
It's really tricky. I do really feel for the Lib Dems in particular, who have backed a lot of reforms for a long time and are making these cases not on the basis of how their electoral positions might fare out, but on the basis of, actually smaller parties should be represented in the Senedd because a lot of people vote for them. So I think that is a real downside, and it's probably a reflection of the D'Hondt system as much as it is the closed list system. It's the D'Hondt system that's really going to potentially hurt them. But I don't think that means that there's kind of no hope for their representation in the future. We've just seen a slate of local government elections where they've actually done reasonably well. Hopefully this system will be proportional enough that they will pick up seats under a proportional list system if they do well. And that's all proportionality can guarantee you, is that if you get some votes, you should get seats. So that's what we'd like to see.
One of the major issues that was raised during the last Senedd was the question of people passing from party to party, sometimes numerous times, without the need for a by-election when they were elected on the regional list. This system does nothing to remedy that problem, does it?
No, and that's one of the kind of big cases that people have been making against the AMS system. I think that was ruled out really quickly, actually, from these discussions, because parties have just not been happy with that system for over 20 years now. So it does confuse me a little bit that the closed list system that we are going with is a little bit of the worst of that world, in a way, from a politician's point of view, because a lot of politicians have really not enjoyed that kind of top-up list element of that. And it's definitely one of the main problems with closed lists is that people are going to be electing parties, not politicians. So there are massive questions, and the Special Purpose Committee report tried to address this over what happens if a politician were to switch party. What happens around like personal performance, personal accountability. If a politician gets elected and does not perform well, but does well again on party list next time, they could still come top of the list. And that's why voter choice is really important. And that's why it's a shame that it's missing from this closed list system.
One of the other interesting developments from these proposals are the Conservatives calling for a referendum on these changes. What's your assessment of that call? I
don't want to be too political, but I do worry about a knee-jerk reaction of any time a political party doesn't like where something's going, they just call for a referendum on it. I've also heard this conversation being had around the kind of devolution of policing and justice. It's there should be a referendum on that. And it does feel like that's a kind of really easy answer to a really complicated question that we'll never actually get to the bottom of, because you can see very easily from 2016 how referenda can be turned into really divisive conversations that actually don't actually reflect the topic actually up for discussion. And it would be really easy for that to happen around Senedd reform, the case for more politicians. So I think it's very much a political kind of decision that they're making to call for referendum, rather than actual belief that this should be something that there's a referendum required on. We see the UK government repeatedly making moves to change democracy in England and across the UK. We've just seen the Elections Act passed. We've seen voter ID. We are seeing the UK government moving the electoral system for police and crime commissioners and for directly elected mayors from the supplementary vote to first past the post. We can see the Prime Minister appointing many more peers of the House of Lords in a year than we're seeing actually being added to the Senedd. Why should there be a kind of double standard? Why should Wales not have these powers when a UK government and a Prime Minister can just totally unilaterally do what it wants? Like, why are we being held to a higher standard here?
I mean, this does seem a bit strange, doesn't it? Because most of the polling in this area recently has shown that the public do seem to be in favour of more members of the Senedd.
Yeah, it depends how the question's asked, but what we are consistently seeing is when you say, do you want more politicians? People are obviously going to say no. When you say, do you want more members of the Senedd to address massive issues around capacity and deliver a stronger parliament for Wales, people are like, yeah, all right then. Like, it's not the case of politicians for more politicians' sake. It's about correcting a deficit and giving Wales the parliament that it needs. And I just really worry that moving to calls around a referendum is completely missing the fact that this is about just strengthening our parliament. It's one thing that we're going to do that's going to be in place for a long, long time, and we're going to have a parliament that properly works for Wales off the back of it.
The recommendations of the report try and introduce a set of proposals in time for 2026, but they also start to review them straight away as part of this two-stage process. Do you think that's a sensible approach? I mean, you've alluded to your thoughts a little bit earlier, but we want to try and make the most of this window of opportunity and potentially improve upon the recommendations. How do you think it should work in practice?
Yeah, I mean, we've been careful not to put a timescale on it, because actually, changes to democracy need a bit of time to embed. Like, it takes a little bit of time for changes to settle in, for people to be clear about how they've worked. But we do think that as part of the legislation, there should be a commitment to review the effectiveness of the changes, particularly around the electoral system and particularly around the gender quotas. There's a real risk that this is untapped ground. Like, we haven't tried this before. Is the zipping going to work? Are we going to get 50-50 gender balance in the Senedd off the back of it? And what happens if we don't, if there's not a review? So embedding some kind of process to ensure that these changes kind of deliver what they're meant to, and also kind of deliver on the principles of the expert panel, because we shouldn't forget that that's a massive comprehensive piece of work that should be underpinning all of this. Will there be a question after the next election of whether the closed list system has delivered those principles? Will there be a question of whether the gender quotas have delivered 50-50? If there isn't, we might be kind of stuck without a paddle.
In order for this to happen by 2026, what could and should we see put in place before we get to this election? What would you want to see the Welsh government do in order to inform people of these changes, and also in terms of how you can educate the broader population about the way that their electoral system is changing? Because unfortunately, we get a few weeks of that before a Senedd election usually, but not a huge amount else.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that these changes are communicated. I mean, we're going to have oh my God, it's stressing me out thinking about it, but we're going to have lots of different electoral systems for lots of different elections. The first election we're going to come to next, in theory, well, it should be anyway, is a general election. That's going to have voter ID. That's going to be done under first past the post. Then we're going to hit a Senedd election. That's going to be an entirely different franchise with no voter ID and with a brand new spanking voting system and brand new constituency. So there is a massive communication challenge for Welsh Government in grappling with this. I won't even get on to the local elections and potentially different voting systems, because that might be a much longer podcast. But I do kind of have heart with the steps Welsh Government are already taking around voter engagement this time round. There's still a long way to go on political education in particular, but we have seen some really good coordination from Welsh Government. We've seen them hiring electoral engagement officers in every local authority. I think those contracts should be extended, by the way. They need to be a full-time position, not just for elections. This is a long-term conversation. It doesn't just start 6 weeks before an election. And they've invested in things like voter pilot. So we're very much at the start of a journey with them kind of working out what they can do to engage voters, and hopefully the third sector stepping in to help. But I'm hopeful that there will be better stuff in place to engage and educate and to start that conversation with voters ahead of 2026.
So you again, you alluded to it a little bit there, but we could very well be in a situation where the 4 UK parliaments all have different voting systems. We probably will be. Do you think this will be an issue in terms of, well, practicality, but also in terms of political education? And can you see that the different countries developing their own sort of distinct political cultures as a consequence?
It definitely makes a stronger case for better political education and better engagement and communication activities around elections. That's just a fact. It really does. If you've got different systems, if you've got, especially in Wales, where you've got a kind of paucity of media, or people just not watching Welsh media and having it reflect back to them, you've almost got a case to compensate, right? You've got a Welsh Government an electoral commission who are going to have to compensate for that reality, and they're going to have to step up their game and do way better than any electoral commission in England and any UK Parliament in England when it comes to a general election. This has got to be like gold standard political education and voter engagement. The second question you asked me, what was that, Matt? Sorry. Political cultures. There we go. It's funny because culture obviously doesn't just come from the way democracy works, but it is a part of that. And I think we have seen different political cultures when it comes to, I think, the pandemic in a way. We've seen in Scotland and Wales kind of higher levels of trust in our politicians, and partly that is a reflection of the individual political characters and the leadership in those nations. But it's also, I think, the fact that parliaments work very differently. We have much more working between parties. There's been, I think, a better discourse around the decisions made in the pandemic. You know, I was in the Senedd in the debate the other day, and there were people watching behind me who were saying, oh, it's very different to Westminster, isn't it? It just is. Like, we have a very different discourse. The way the Senedd is set up is very different. And I do think that our politicians take a different approach, and that somewhere down the line will reflect on our political culture.
So, but before this happens, obviously there'll be a bill at some point, but these proposals do need to be backed by the Labour Party at a special conference as well. And whilst these changes do feel very beneficial to the Labour Party, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of MSs or party members willing to go out and back for them. I mean, it feels inevitable that these changes will be passed by the special conference. But do you think there's any chance they could be rejected by the party in the summer? And what would happen if that were to be the case?
I hope not. I don't have my mystic ball. Like, what is it? Crystal ball? Mystic ball? I'm not Mystic Meg. Crystal ball. There we go. Don't have my crystal ball with me today. But I do take a lot of heart from the Welsh Labour conference back in, oh God, was that March? Back in March, we saw a very different party when it comes to this issue than we've ever seen before. You know, a debate was held on approving a motion for the First Minister to essentially start negotiations with Plaid Cymru. I very much went into that conference hall, you know, with ready to kind of flee if I had to. And yet it was like nothing we've ever seen before. we had an hour debate, I think, for it. Every single speaker spoke in support of reforming the Senedd. It feels like the Labour Party have really kind of got behind the idea of the Senedd needing to mature and to be an effective institution, and it feels to an extent like it's gone beyond their party in what they're talking about. They're talking about a modern democracy. They're talking about a stronger parliament for Wales. So I would really hope that debate, which got unanimous backing, which I don't think anyone was expecting, kind of follows through to this special conference in July. And I don't think that there are signs yet that anything could necessarily derail that. I do think that there are concerns within the party about the closed list system that's been chosen and the constituencies. But, we saw last week in the debate, politicians were talking about compromise. This is no one's kind of perfect package. It is a compromise package. And hopefully the Labour Party will back this package on the understanding that actually as legislation is put in place, it might need to evolve, it might need to improve, but the principle of a stronger Senedd is right, and this package will start delivering that.
So, you basically answered my next question, but these changes are definitely then worth supporting. It is worth, having another process, not an event moment in Welsh devolution, and saying this is on the right step, even if it's not the perfect one.
Yeah, I don't think, we're never going to get a package we can pick and mix and be like, yeah, I'll take that, but I won't take that. The reality is this is a take it or leave it package. And if we leave it, there is no Senedd reform. This is something that we carry on complaining about in terms of the size of the Senedd for the next 20 years, and nothing ever gets done about it because one time there was that option and everyone rejected it. We can't be that picky. Like, it has to be that this take it or leave it deal is taken. We can potentially improve it as it progresses, whether that's through legislation or after legislation. But ultimately, it will deliver the thing that we've been asking for a long time, which is a stronger Senedd with 96 members. And that in itself is worth doing.
So I know the real question that I'm sure everybody wants to know, and I don't know whether you've done the modelling on it yet or not, but if with this system, perhaps on maybe say using last year's election results, what does the Senedd actually then look like in terms of numbers?
So we have modelled a 90 and 100 seat Senedd based on a closed list proportional system under last year's election, but that is obviously a very different concept to modelling a 96 seat Senedd under these constituencies, and also massively comes with a health warning. Any modelling is not how an election would actually look like. It's not a reflection of how people would actually vote under a different system. We've seen people vote very differently under a closed list system before, when it was used for European parliamentary elections in Wales. I think Labour might look away now at the results of those. So we did model 90 and 100s. I think they were good for Labour. It showed kind of a similar representation of the parties that we have now, in terms of Labour being the largest, the Conservatives, then Plaid Cymru, and the Lib Dems picking up a couple of seats. So I wouldn't expect necessarily massive changes off the back of it, but that'll probably get quoted back at me in 4.5, 5 years when I'm completely wrong, because it's an election going to be run under completely different constituencies with a completely different system, and voters of 2026 might have very different views to voters of 2021.
It's too cool a game for anybody to ever quote back bad predictions at people, because if that was the case, I'd have so many thrown back in my face. You
should get some kind of like a health warning siren to be used when anyone ever does any predictions on this podcast.
Prediction warning.
Oh God, we'll get that. We'll get Rich to install a button. Jess, thanks so much for coming to talk to us. To finish off, what else are ERS Cymru doing this Senedd term in the next year? Have you got any other big plans?
Oh, we've got very big plans indeed. I hope there's some councillors that listen to the Arrive podcast. If so, we'll hopefully be in touch shortly to talk to you about all things local democracy, including changing the voting system in your area. That's going to be our focus, as well as Senedd reform over the next few years. But of course, we're always working on things around diversity. The gender quotas are a good start, but that's not going to necessarily represent groups from other protected characteristics who are missing from the Senedd, particularly around race and ethnicity. So we're working with our colleagues at the Women's Equality Network Wales on the Diverse 50-50 campaign. We're also doing loads of stuff around engagement for the election with our democracy group Cymru. But yeah, if anyone wants to find out more, it's all on our website.
Great. And if people want to hear more from you on Twitter, where can they go?
I'm at Jess Blair 7, I think.
And ERS?
At ERS Cymru.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on Twitter and Facebook at HiraethPod, or on our brand new website, www.walespolitics.com.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.